Have you heard of King Josiah? A lot of people haven't, which is a shame, because this remarkable young man, descendant of King David, who ruled in Jerusalem 2,600 years ago, made a remarkable contribution to the survival of Judaism and the Jewish people. So let me tell you about him. I'm going to begin with his grandfather Manasseh, who was the greatest villain to sit upon King David's throne. The man was a monster. He declared war on the God of Israel. He polluted the God's temple with idolatrous symbols. He set up an Asherah, a whorehouse next to the temple to service the worshippers. He established pagan shrines throughout the land in order to promote the worship of pagan gods while suppressing the worship of the one true God. So successful was he that during his reign the Torah disappeared. Nobody knew any more of the Torah. He reigned for 55 years, during which time, says the author of the Book of Kings, he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other with blood, a thug. He was succeeded by his son Amnon, who was no better than his daddy, but at least he reigned for only 12 years before he was assassinated, and therefore his damage was limited. Amnon was succeeded by his son Josiah, who in complete contrast to his granddaddy and his daddy was a devotee of the God of Israel. And early in his reign he instituted a refurbishment of the temple and a revision of its resources. And during the course of that refurbishment, the workmen made a discovery. You probably guessed it. They discovered a copy of the Torah. Nobody knew what it was, hadn't seen it. They brought it to the high priest, who immediately dispatched it to the king with a message, "Please read." And as the king read it, he wept and he tore his garments as a sign of mourning, because now he realized how he and his people had neglected the commandments of God, both the positive commandments and the negative commandments. And also he read in the Torah the consequences for doing this. The Tochacha, we'll be reading it shortly, which spells out the doom, the horrors that will become upon the nation of Israel if they disobey God. King Josiah, so overcome by this, sent his men to consult a prophetess, Huldah, who lived in Jerusalem, and she confirmed his worst fears. Judah will be destroyed. Jerusalem will be destroyed. The temple will be destroyed. And a major proportion of your population will be carried off into exile. And the people bring back this response to his request. But how did Josiah respond to this terrible news? Amazingly, he engaged in a frenetic, energetic reform, a revolution. He cleared the temple of all its idolatrous symbols. He shut down the whorehouse. He suppressed all the pagan shrines throughout the land. Then, as a climax to all of this, he celebrated a festival, because he had discovered in the Torah a festival which everybody had forgotten, the festival of Pesach, which the author of the Book of Kings assured us has not been observed in the nation of Israel for 800 years. Throughout the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, since the days of the judges, this festival had been neglected. And so Josiah instituted it as a national festival. He himself organized it. He provided the sacrificial animals, the lambs, and the people celebrated. And indeed, they were celebrating two things: the birth of their nation and the spiritual rebirth of the nation of Israel. Of course, it leaves us with an obvious question. Why did Josiah do this? I mean, he knew there was no reprieve. The people were doomed. So why did he do it? I think the answer is a simple one. This pious young man, having discovered the right thing to do, said, I will do it. And he does, and leaves the consequences to God. Now, what were those consequences? This I'll tell you about next time. There were consequences for Josiah way beyond his wildest imagination. He himself died. This was predicted by Huldah, that he would be spared the misery. And unfortunately, he was killed in battle against Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. And sure enough, after his death, his revolution, his reforms began to unwind. The people returned to their bad old ways. But the Torah did not disappear again. It had a guardian like Jeremiah to ensure that it remained in view. So when the people ultimately went into exile, they carried their Torah with them. It became the basis of their new society in Babylon. Indeed, it stimulated generations of Torah scholars who interpreted and expounded the law, and whose work ultimately gave rise to the Babylonian Talmud, that seminal work upon which Judaism and Jewish life is based. And I feel that this was in no small measure due to a young man who lived in Jerusalem 2,600 years ago, who acknowledged his responsibilities, saw what was right to do, and did it, and left consequences to God. And that's a thought I'd like you to carry over into the penitential period. We are now in Elul. We're preparing ourselves for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So I'd like you to remember Josiah's principle. Acknowledge the right thing and do it. And remember this in conjunction with a statement by Rambam. Rambam says when man's total evil will outweigh his total good, God will destroy the world. He's done it before, he'll do it again. But we are here, thank God, despite all the rotten things happening in our world. So it indicates that at this stage we're level pegging. Man's evil is outweighed by his good. And that means that the very next good deed, the very next mitzvah performed by anyone, will tip the scales in favor of salvation. It will bring salvation to mankind. And consequently, I want you to make a resolution for the coming new year. If a good deed presents itself to you, do it. You have the opportunity to perform a mitzvah, perform it. You have the opportunity to say a kind word, say it. Because somebody is going to bring salvation to mankind. And that somebody could be you.